Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. In this lecture, we will continue to discuss the internal features of the hypothalamus. In the first lecture, we talk about three major parts of the hypothalamus. And one of that part, which comprise of hypothalamic nuclei, is the anterior part of the lateral wall of the third ventricle. Now, second part is the structures in the anterior part of floor of third ventricle. Now, what are the structures which belong to the hypothalamus? In this part are optic chiasma, tuber cinereum, infundibulum, pars nervosa of Pituitary, mammillary bodies, and posterior perforated substance. So we will discuss the internal features of these parts of the hypothalamus, starting with the optic chiasma. Now, optic chiasma, it is a part of hypothalamus. It is part of hypothalamus. Why? Because it developed from diencephalon, forebrain. You know, the neural plate, it changes into neural tube, and the cephalic part of the neural tube divides into forebrain, midbrain, and hindbrain vesicles, which give origin to the different parts of the prosencephalon, mesencephalon, etc., and rest of that change into spinal cord. So, because optic chiasma, optic nerve developed from diencephalon, forebrain, this is why it is included as part of the hypothalamus. Now, what is the optic nerve? Optic nerve is extension of the white matter of forebrain. Therefore, optic nerve, it is considered as a tract. Not a peripheral nerve. Optic nerve is extension of the white matter of the forebrain, comprising of neurons processes, that is axons or nerve fibers. So it is not a peripheral nerve. Now what are the different points which favor that optic nerve is not a peripheral nerve? It is a tract. Number one, it is the extension of white matter of forebrain. Now it is a tract comprising of nerve fibers or axons of neurons. Now brain and spinal cord, you know, they are covered by meninges, the pia mater, arachnoid mater, dura mater from within outward. So because optic nerve is considered as a tract, therefore it is also covered by meninges. Number four, why it is a tract, not peripheral nerve? It is bathed by cerebrospinal fluid. The subarachnoid space between the pia mater and arachnoid mater, it continues over the optic nerves filled with cerebrospinal fluid. Number five, oligodendrocytes. Are the glial cells found in optic nerve. The supporting cell of the CNS are glial cells. We divide them into central glial cells and peripheral glial cells. Central glial cells, they are within the brain and spinal cord, while the peripheral glial cells, they are associated with peripheral nerves. Now, for central myelination, the glial cell responsible are oligodendrocytes, and for peripheral myelination, the glial cells are Schwann cells. Now, because the optic nerve is tract, therefore it will have the central glial cells, that is oligodendrocytes, not Schwann cells. So this point also favors that the optic nerve is a tract, not a peripheral nerve. Then number six, diseases which damage the tracts in CNS will also damage optic nerve. The diseases which damage the tracts within the CNS, brain and spinal cord, they will also damage the optic nerve, not the other peripheral nerves. Not the peripheral nerves. So this is why that optic nerves, they are considered as a tract. So this was about the optic nerve, considered as a tract, not a peripheral nerve. And these are the points in favor of this fact that optic nerves are tracts. Now, optic nerves, they arise from the eyeball. Right and left eyeball. Suppose this is nasal half of each eyeball. Retina, nasal half of the retina of eyeball. And this is the temporal half of retina of each eyeball. So optic nerves, they arise from the eyeball. And the fibers of the optic nerve partially decussate at the optic chiasma. And from the optic chiasma, optic tracts, right and left optic tracts, they arise. The optic tracts then divide into a medial root and a lateral root. The lateral root terminates into the lateral geniculate body on each side. Here is the midbrain. The medial roots of the optic tract enter the midbrain. Optic nerve. Optic chiasma. Optic tract. Lateral geniculate body. Then here is the visual cortex, occipital lobes of right and left cerebral hemisphere. Visual cortex, broad main cortical areas 17, 18, 19. Then from the lateral genicular body, optic radiation arises, which end in the visual cortex. Now this is the visual pathway. Now the fibers which arise from the medial half or nasal half of the retina, they run through the optic nerve, cross at the optic chiasma, and then follow the opposite optic tract on each side. Then the fibers from nasal half of the retina, fibers from temporal half of the retina run through the optic nerve, optic chiasma without decussation, and then follow the optic tract of same side. This is the temporal half of the retina, and this is nasal half. So if the optic chiasma partial decussation takes place, that is the nasal fibers and macular fibers decussate while the temporal fibers, they are uncrossed. Till the optic chiasma. So only nasal fibers and macular fibers, they decussate. At the optic chiasma. Now what is the internal structure of the optic chiasma? If we cut a section through the optic chiasma, in the center will be the macular fibers. Above the macular fibers, the nasal fibers, upper quadrant nasal fibers and lower quadrant nasal fibers. Upper quadrant nasal fibers located above the macular fibers, which are in the center, and lower quadrant nasal fibers will be below the macular fibers. And on each side, right side, left side, uncrossed fibers. That is temporal fibers. will be present at the level of optic chiasma. So this is a section through optic chiasma to show its internal features. So if you cut a section through the optic chiasma, you will see that the crossed macular fibers, they are in the center. Then above the fibers of macula will be the upper quadrant nasal fibers, which are also crossed. And below the macular fibers within the optic chiasma will be the crossed lower quadrant nasal fibers. And on each side will be the ipsilateral fibers, temporal fibers, right side and left side. So this was the internal structure of the optic chiasma. Now what are the relations of optic chiasma which are important? Now before that, in the dorsal half of the optic chiasma, there are some fibers known as the Commissure of Gudden. In the dorsal half of the optic chiasma, there are some nerve fibers known as the Commissure of the Gudden. Now there are two important points about it, that these are not commissural fibers. And their connections are unknown. But these are present here. Now what are the relations of the optic chiasma? Now if we draw a section to the corpus callosum separating the right and left cerebral hemispheres. This is corpus callosum which is cut, and you are familiar with this diagram because we have drawn this diagram again and again. You know the fornix and septum pellucidum. This is frontal pole and this is occipital pole. So here above is the bundle of commissural fibers known as the anterior commissure. Below it, a thin membrane of nerve tissue called lamina terminalis, and behind is the pineal body attached by pineal stalk to the posterior wall of the third ventricle, and in the lower part is the posterior commissure. Then below on the basal surface of the cerebral hemisphere, this is optic chiasma. Behind the optic chiasma is tuber cinereum and infundibulum. To the lower end of infundibulum pituitary gland is suspended. Behind the tuber cinereum there are right and left mammillary bodies. I've shown the mammillary body of one side, and still behind it is the midbrain. Now this is brain. Now it is located in the cranial cavity. Section through the skull. Now this is the body of the sphenoid bone. Body of the sphenoid bone of skull. In the body of sphenoid bone of the skull there is a fossa known as the pituitary fossa. And the pituitary fossa is occupied by pituitary gland. And this fossa is roofed by a fold of dura mater known as diaphragma sellae. This is the infundibulum of the pituitary gland, which passes through diaphragma sellae and to which the pituitary gland is suspended. Now this is optic chiasma. Now, what are the relations of the optic chiasma? Now, on the basal surface of cerebral hemisphere in the midline. The optic nerves which join the optic chiasma anterolaterally, and posterolaterally from the optic chiasma, right and left optic tracts, they emerge. Now, what are their relations? On the inferior surface, laterally on each side, is the terminal part of the internal carotid arteries. Right and left, internal carotid artery. Here the artery divides into anterior and middle cerebral arteries. So lateral relations of the optic chiasma on each side are the internal carotid arteries. Posteriorly is the tuber cinereum, to which the infundibulum is connected. Tuber cinereum. So internal carotid arteries are related laterally on each side, while tuber cinereum is the posterior relation, or posterior to the optic chiasm. Now, inferior relation, here in the lateral view section, this is optic chiasma, and what are its inferior relation? Posterior relation, you can see the tuber cinereum in this diagram also. Tuber cinereum and infundibulum. And initial part of the infundibulum are related posterior to the optic chiasma. So posterior relations are also visible in the lateral view. Now, inferior relation. Now you can see inferior to the optic chiasma. This is optic chiasma. Inferior to it is the pituitary fossa or hypophyseal fossa in the body of sphenoid bone, and this fossa is housed by the pituitary gland, connected to the tuber cinereum by infundibulum, and this pituitary fossa or hypophyseal fossa is bridged by a layer of dura mater known as the diaphragma sellae, just like a diaphragm. So you can see below the optic chiasma is the pituitary gland. Now it is clinically important in cases of tumors, or if the pituitary gland is enlarged, it will compress the optic chiasma from below. When it is enlarged, it will compress the optic chiasma from below. This will result in the compression of the lower quadrant nasal fibers. Just explained in a section, I told you, below the macular fibers are lower quadrant nasal fibers. So here are lower quadrant nasal fiber, macular fibers in the middle, and upper quadrant nasal fibers, and on each side temporal fibers. So when the pituitary gland is enlarged, or there is some tumor of the pituitary gland, and because pituitary gland is related posterior to the optic chiasma, so there is a possibility that the enlarged pituitary glands or their tumors will compress the lower part of the optic chiasma, compressing the lower nasal quadrant fibers. This will cause visual defects And the visual defect resulting will be the bitemporal upper nasal bitemporal upper quadrant hemianopia. The temporal field of vision will show the bitemporal upper quadrant hemianopia when the optic chiasma is compressed from below by the enlarged pituitary gland. So inferior relation is very important. So in this way we completed the internal features and relations of the optic chiasma, which is considered as part of the diaphragm. Next part next to optic chiasma is tuber cinereum. This is also a very important part of the hypothalamus. In this diagram you can see easily the tuber cinereum, and from below it the pituitary stalk or infundibular stalk extend downwards, by which pituitary gland is suspended. Now in the large view of this part, suppose this is optic chiasma. And behind the optic chiasma, there is a layer of gray matter, which is known as tuber cinereum. Optic chiasma is the lamina terminalis, then anterior commissure, and behind the tuber cinereum are right and left mammillary bodies. Because it is lateral view, therefore I have shown only one mammillary body. Now tuber cinereum, it is a layer of gray matter, and from the center of this tuber cinereum a conical projection extends downwards. This is known as the median eminence, a conical projection. And from the apex of this conical projection, which arises from this tuber cinereum, pituitary stalk or infundibular stalk extend downwards. And this pituitary stalk or infundibular stalk is continuous with neurohypophysis. Or pars nervosa. Pars nervosa of the pituitary gland and the adenohypophysis comprising of different parts. Have no direct connection with the hypothalamus. And you know, here is hypothalamic sulcus. Posterior commissure, spinal body, posterior commissure, spinal stalk, spinal body, and this is posterior commissure. This is the thalamus, and below and in front of it is hypothalamus, lateral wall of the third ventricle. Now, tuber cinereum is a layer of gray matter. From the center of it, a conical projection extends downwards, which is known as the median eminence. Into the tuber cinereum, lower part of Arcuate nucleus, of hypothalamus extends. The arcuate nucleus of the hypothalamus extends downwards into the tuber cinereum for a short distance. Now, if we draw the inferior view of the tuber cinereum, optic nerves, optic chiasma, optic tracts, cut ends of the optic nerve, optic tracts. Now, behind the optic chiasma, this is tuber cinereum. Basal surface of the cerebrum, and on the orbital part of the basal surface, olfactory bulbs, olfactory tract, and olfactory stria on each side, close to the anterior perforated substance. Here is anterior perforated substance. Now close to the tuber cinereum, there are some nerve fibers known as nervi terminalis. Here, close to the tuber cinereum, nervi terminalis, which run forwards and continue onto the medial side of olfactic tract on each side. Nervi terminalis. These nerve fibers, starting close to the tuber cinereum, run forward on the basal surface of cerebrum on each side and passes just medial to the olfactory tract, then pass through cribriform plate, of ethmoid bone to enter the nasal cavity. So these nerve fibers, starting close to the tuber cinereum, run forwards, reach medial to the olfactory tract, pierces to the cribriform plate of the ethmoid bone, and enter into the nasal cavity. And in the nasal cavity, these are believed to supply the nasal mucosa. And nasal glands. These fibers are the nervi terminalis, are considered as the cephalic extension of sympathetic trunk. So this was about the tuber cinereum, which is considered as part of the hypothalamus. Now behind the tuber cinereum, behind the optic chiasma, from the tip of the median eminence of tuber cinereum, infundibular stalk arises, or infundibulum arises. So next topic is infundibulum. Infundibulum or pituitary stalk or infundibular stalk. these are bundle of nerve fibers which start from the apex of the median eminence, which is part of tuber cinereum, extend downwards, slightly forwards, and it is functionally and structurally continuous with the neurohypophysis, that is the pars nervosa of the pituitary gland. So infundibulum connect the median eminence of tuber cinereum with pituitary gland, that is neurohypophysis, or to be more specific, pars nervosa of the pituitary gland. Now this infundibulum, it comprises of axons or nerve fibers of supraoptic and paraventricular nuclei of hypothalamus. These are the axons or nerve fibers of preoptic and paraventricular nuclei of the hypothalamus. Now these axons are fibers from this region. Here, for example, this is supraoptic nucleus, and this is paraventricular nucleus, for example. The axons of the neurons of these two nuclei, they traverses through the infundibulum, enter the pars nervosa, and these nerve fibers in pars nervosa pars nervosa these nerve fibers terminate in herring bodies in the pars nervosa. There are ball-like structures which are the terminals of these axons. For example, this is a neuron with cell body, dendrites, and then this is axon, and the axon enter the pars nervosa of the pituitary gland. This is adenohypophysis, anterior pituitary. So these axons enter the pars nervosa, where they terminate into these swellings known as the herring bodies. And this is a neuron body. Neuron of the hypothalamic nuclei, paraterminal and supraoptic nuclei. Now, these nuclei, supraoptic and paraventricular nuclei, the hypothalamus, they synthesize hormones, ADH, antidiuretic hormone, and oxytocin. These are the hormones produced by paraventricular and supraoptic nuclei of the hypothalamus. And these hormones from the neurons of these hypothalamic nuclei traverses through the nerve fibers of these neurons, and these hormones are then stored in the hearing bodies. Hearing body storage of hormones, the ADH and oxytocin, and close to these hearing bodies in the pars neurosa there are blood capillaries. And when the need arises, these stored hormones are released into the blood circulation, into the nearby blood capillaries. Thus, the nerve fibers of the infundibulum, they do not innervate the pars nervosa. They act like duct. The infundibulum act like a duct. Act like a duct through which these hormones, they are transported from the neurons of hypothalamic nuclei into the pars nervosa and stored in the hearing bodies. These do not innervate the pars nervosa. No. This was about the pituitary stalk or infundibulum or infundibular stalk. Next part of the hypothalamus is pituitary. Now, pituitary gland or hypophysis. Next important part of the hypothalamus. Now, we divide the pituitary gland into various parts, various lobes. So, gross anatomically, we divide the pituitary gland into anterior lobe and posterior lobe. Suppose this is tuber cinereum, this is infundibulum. This is anterior lobe. And this is posterior lobe. With a cleft in between these two. anterior lobe of pituitary gland, and this is posterior lobe of pituitary gland, and in between these two there is a small space, cleft. So this is how gross anatomically we divide the pituitary gland into these lobes. Now physiological lobes. Again we have tuber cinereum, infundibulum, and lobes of the pituitary gland. Now, this one physiologically is known as adenohypophysis. And this one is known as neurohypophysis. Again with a cleft in between. Adenohypophysis is the anterior lobe of gross anatomy, and neurohypophysis is the posterior lobe of gross anatomy. Next, embryologically, histologically, structurally, we divide the pituitary gland into various lobes. Histologically, again, tuber cinereum, median eminence, from the apex of which the infundibulum or pituitary stalk arises, and the lower end of a pituitary gland is suspended. Now histologically we divide it into, again based on structure, into various lobes. Based on structural differences, historical differences, we again divide the pituitary gland into various lobes. Now, this is called pars distalis. This upward extension which turn around the lower part of the infundibulum, this is known as pars tuberalis. Then small part inside which is just applied to the pars nervosa, this is known as the pars intermedia. And this part which is in structural and functional continuity with the infundibulum tuber cinereum, that is hypothalamus. This is known as the pars nervosa. So this is how we divide the pituitary gland based on histological differences. The pars tuberalis, pars distalis, pars intermedia, and behind it is the pars nervosa, which is continuous with the infundibulum. And between these two is the cleft between pars distalis and intermedia. So this is how we divide the pituitary gland into different histological parts. So based on gross anatomy, we have anterior and posterior lobe. Based on functional differences, different types of hormones, physiologically, we divide it into adenohypophysis, which is nothing but anterior lobe of the pituitary gland. And histologically, it is comprising of pars tuberalis, pars distalis, and pars intermedia. Histologically, it comprises of pars tuberalis, pars distalis, and pars intermedia. Now, developmentally, pituitary gland developed from two sources. From two sources. It arises from general ectoderm and neuroectoderm. The adenohypophysis is derived from general ectoderm, while the neuroectoderm derived from the part of the pituitary derived from neuroectoderm is the pars nervosa neurohypophysis. Now, how these develop, briefly I will explain. This is the cephalic region of the embryo. Cephalic end and tail end. Inside is the neural tube, which is divided into forebrain vesicle, midbrain vesicle, hindbrain vesicle, and rest of the tubular part, which later on give origin to the spinal cord. Now this is the primitive buccal cavity. This is endoderm, pharynx, esophagus, stomach, small gut, large gut, down to the anal canal. Now this is oral cavity, the primitive buccal cavity known as the stomodium. And this is surface ectoderm, general ectoderm. This is the head region, cephalic region. Now this is primitive oral cavity known as the stomodium. Now you can see it has a roof lined by ectoderm, general surface ectoderm, and floor. Now from the roof of this stomodium, a pouch arises, which is known as the Rathke's pouch. Initially, it has the buccal cavity primitive has a communication with this pouch. So you can see this pouch is derived from the general ectodermal lining of the roof of the oral cavity. Therefore, this pouch is originating from general ectoderm. Similarly, from the forebrain region of the neural tube, it extends forwards towards the Rathke's pouch. Forebrain belonging to the neuroectoderm. Now, as the development proceeds, this extension from the forebrain, it approaches the Rathke's pouch. Now what happens? The cells of the anterior wall of the Rathke's pouch proliferate and become thickened, and the posterior wall cells also proliferate. Then the connection between the roof of the stomodium or primitive buccal cavity, it degenerate and disappear. So in this way, as the development progress, this anterior wall of the Rathke's pouch becomes the pars distalis, pars tuberalis, and this cells of the posterior wall becomes pars intermedia. And the lumen of the Rathke's pouch, which persists as the cleft, this one, cleft between pars distalis and pars intermedia, a cleft between pars distalis and pars intermedia, and behind it, this is derived from neuroectoderm forebrain in the region of diencephalon, is the pars nervosa. Are neurohypophyses, and these are parts of the adenohypophyses. So, as far as the pituitary gland is concerned, we talked about the gross anatomical anterior and posterior lobes. Based on physiological aspects, hormones release, their function, etc., we divide it into adenohypophysis and neurohypophysis. The gross anatomy and anterior lobe is nothing but adenohypophysis, and the gross anatomical posterior lobe is the neurohypophysis. Then based on structural differences, historical differences, we divide the adenohypophysis into three parts: pars distalis, pars tuberalis, and pars intermedia. The cavity of the Rathke's pouch persists between pars distalis and pars intermedia, so this is cleft. And behind it is the pars nervosa, which is in continuity with the infundibulum, the median eminence, and the tuber cinereum of hypothalamus. So these are parts of the hypothalamus: tuber cinereum, median eminence, infundibulum, and pars nervosa. And you can see the anterior lobe adenohypophysis has no neural connection with the hypothalamus. So these were the different parts of the pituitary gland. And in the next lecture we will continue with the further detail about pituitary gland, mammillary bodies, posterior perforated substance. Then we will talk about the subthalamic tegmental region of the hypothalamus. All these will be the internal features of hypothalamus. Thank you very much.